We'd like you to be seated, please. There are, as usual, plenty of seats in the front row. The first row to be filled is always the back row, it doesn't matter how far back it is. And a few more just coming in to take their seats now. I'll wait for a moment. That's good. Yes. The others, latecomers will have to pick up their own chair and walk with it. Okay, thank you very much. For those who don't know me, I'm Howard Fisher. I'm one of the committee members of the Sydney Adventist Forum and former full-time lecturer at Avondale University, and now an occasional contract cameo performer. But I'll give you welcome to this meeting of Sydney Adventist Forum this afternoon. It's been a while since we've had a live meeting. I'm not sure if this is the first since COVID or not. It may well be. But it's good that we can gather together and contemplate things of interest to ourselves and our church and our faith. Speaking of more forum meetings, there's another one coming up on the 25th of February. Rainer Brunsma from, it's one of the European divisions, I forget which one, and Trans-European will be visiting, and he will be making a presentation on the 25th of February. I'm fairly sure it will be here, but you'll get notices. If it's not here, it would be in the northern districts of Sydney somewhere, I think, but I think it's here. That's about all I have to say by way of announcement, so I'll invite Trafford, please, to come and offer a prayer.
Well, we thank you for this occasion this afternoon where we can just pause and take time out to reflect on history and allow us to speak to the present and possibly the future. We pray for Gil as he presents. We thank you for his ministry and for Kendra and the fact that they can be with us this short while. We thank you, Lord, for this day, a day you've given to us just to chill and reflect on you a little more maybe than what we do during the week. And we thank you for that occasion, that privilege, and we dedicate this time to you and to the strengthening of our minds for Jesus' sake. Amen.
As Trafford mentioned in his prayer, it's lovely to see Gil and Kendra with us. I think Avondale is one of the many places in the world that at least for some time they call home. There are quite a few places, I guess, they can go to and say it's good to be back home. But we have a special place for Gil and Kendra. So, my first memory of Gil is when I was a member of the Avondale Singers. And we went to sing at the Castle Hill Seventh-day Adventist Church. And there was a baptism. And why I remember it is because the baptismal font in Castle Hill Church, I don't know if it still is, but it was behind the rostrum in a fairly elevated position. So the congregation could see the full baptismal font in vertical section, as it were. And there was Gil baptising some baptismal candidates. I think that's the first time I came across Gil. And then I knew him for quite some time when he was at Avondale as vice president, and encountered him professionally and socially. I think we had a squash game in a squash competition once. So, but Gil has kind of been a person that I've known about for many years, and I'm so pleased that he is here to share his insights with us today. And we welcome Kendra especially, who served in the theology department of Avondale, lecturer in New Testament for some years, and both have been participants in our somewhat notorious E14 Sabbath School. Many of the people in this audience I recognise from our E14 Sabbath School, and they are occasionally able to participate even from remote California, because we've been on Zoom for almost 3 years now. So we get participation. The difficulty is, of course, that when we're meeting on Sabbath morning here, it's still Friday afternoon in California. So, but that's good. So, Gil, we welcome you, and we look forward with anticipation to what you can tell us about Siegfried Horn and what we might learn from his life. Thank you, Gil.
Well, thank you, Howard, for that warm introduction. And I feel very affirmed this afternoon. With so many here, this is February, holidays have just finished, and it would be much easier to be at the beach, wouldn't it? Sabbath afternoon, no? So here you are, and you have an interest in Adventist history, and I feel very affirmed by that. This afternoon, I'd like to begin by drawing our attention to the last chapter of the Gospel of John, a chapter which introduces us to two people, two characters, who lived under significant pressure. Scripture tells us that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were two prominent citizens who, for fear of the Jews, resorted to a secret life. They felt the necessity of keeping their convictions about Jesus to themselves. They concealed their inner thoughts and lived a life under a code of secrecy. Not a lot of detail about these two characters. We know Nicodemus was one who earlier visited Jesus by night, but only in the last part of the Gospel do we have them really in some detail. And of course, Joseph of Arimathea, the wealthy man who provided the tomb for Jesus. And Nicodemus, who midway during the Gospel speaks up tentatively to allow for Jesus to have a hearing, at least, don't condemn him out of hand. So, at least in a mild way, he speaks up for him. There's no discussion in Scripture of the compromises they had to make in this life of secret discipleship. No discussion of the ethical dilemmas they faced. No discussion of the risk that they faced from fear of the Jews, what that would mean for their employment, what that would mean for their social status, or for the welfare of those who depended on them. No discussion of that. And yet, the narrative of the Gospel is not condemning of them. The narrative of the Gospel is rather affirming that here again they stood for Jesus. So these two New Testament characters experienced, at least for a time, life under pressure. Today we're going to be considering the dilemma of a prominent Adventist figure who lived a life under pressure, under a code of secrecy, necessitated by somewhat different circumstances to the two characters in the Gospel, but nevertheless, a character in modern Adventism who experienced significant pressure. And there are two questions that I would like us to think about as a way of framing the topic and framing our thinking about Siegfried Horn. How does a person cope? How does a person relate to one's community of faith when one's own intellectual growth outstrips or outruns that of the community in which they are a part? How does one cope when seemingly indisputable facts keep emerging that one's community is unable to accommodate or to adjust to. How does one remain part of a community in those kind of circumstances? Can reflections on the life of Siegfried Horn help us with that? So, lessons from the life of Siegfried Horn. Pastor, missionary, prisoner of war, professor, archaeologist, and seminary dean of all things. Pinnacle of his career, and a highly respected role, a very trusted role in the denomination. First, a couple of caveats, if I may. I never met the fellow, never heard him speak, never shook his hand. So when I'm talking about him today, I acknowledge that I feel somewhat of an amateur. It may be that some of you here met him or sat in his classes. Any hands? Ah, Lyle at the back, and Gailey, and Ray. Sat in his classes at Edmonds? Okay, Norman's back. Anybody sit in a class when he came here in 1965 to teach at Adventism? Okay, he conducted a seminary extension school, 1965. Well, I never even had that privilege. So some of you know the man in ways that I have not been able to come to know him. And yet I feel that I've been able to get to know him at arm's length, as it were, through his biography by Joyce Rochard, Survivor. Some of you may have read that. By his autobiography, Thomas Deferred, which is the story of his imprisonment years. He wrote that himself quite late in life. But more because I was able to read his diary. I'm indebted to Larry Garrity for allowing me to read the diary of Horn, which began back when he was a student at Friedensau and went right through most of his years to his very latter part of his life. And this is what each page looks like: meticulous handwritten script. Dates carefully noted, everything that he ever observed or asked a question about is jotted down in his many volumes of his diary. I was actually responding to an invitation from the General Conference to write an article on Glacier View for the encyclopedia, the New Adventist Encyclopedia, and also an article on Palmdale Conference. So in preparing for that material, I had been reading some of Pearson's correspondence, and I asked Larry Garrity if he knew if there was anything in the diary that might relate to the events surrounding Glacier View. He had a look and discovered, in fact, there was some very significant entries in his diary about that event. And I found that helpful. And then later, beyond that, as I began writing or researching for the book, which I hope you've all read, Ostriches and Canaries. If you haven't read it, it's available on Amazon. But this is the story of the period of the Pearson administration. It was as I was working on that I was talking to Larry about some other things that the diary might say, and he said, well, why don't you read it for yourself? And so I had this very great privilege of reading the diary myself, and I feel that I've been able to get to know Horn significantly in that way. One more important caveat. Because I'm using the lens of a life under pressure, I don't want to convey the idea that Horn's life was completely dominated by that pressure, and that it was a miserable, uncomfortable life, and that he struggled, and that it wasn't very enjoyable. In fact, Horn had a rich, fulfilling life, professionally as an archaeologist, as a teacher, in his service for the church, and in his field of archaeology, and he looked back on that life with a great deal of gratitude and sense of fulfillment. So, in that sense, using the lens of a life under pressure may sound a bit distorting, but it was those aspects of his life under pressure which are so instructive for us today, who face some of the similar challenges and some of the difficulties that he faced. So with those two caveats in place, let me take one more moment to set up our discussion today with a brief reference to another story that some of you may have encountered. How many of you read Shantung Compound? Langdon Gilkey, professor from Chicago University, the story of 2,000 people crammed into a prisoner of war camp, the territory of which was about 100 meters by 150 meters. So if you imagine coming up this little cul-de-sac here from the gate, where the bar goes down and up to here with a row of houses on each side, that's about the length around the cul-de-sac at home. 2,000 people in a walled compound that size. That's the story of the Shantung Compound, the story of men and women under pressure. Gilkey tells the story of how living under such desperate circumstances, under a military hierarchy, a hostile military overlordship there in Shantung, a little province in China, 1940. There were all sorts of pressures that they had to cope with. And there were a lot of missionaries in that compound, because the Japanese had rounded up all the missionaries in China, and many of them had been confined. It's a really interesting book to read if you want to get a chance to take the opportunity to read it. He talks about the struggles that they had in that compound over very ordinary things, trying to be just and fair with people. The amount of sugar, how much sugar should everybody get? How do you achieve a sense of justice with the sharing of sugar? How do you get a sense of justice when potatoes are limited and you've got to share those around? And what do you do with large ones and small ones? All sorts of quarrels. And space. How do you cope with crammed space when space is already premium on it and you're sleeping in very narrow circumstances, and then the military brings in another bunch of prisoners and force them onto you, and these missionaries say, no, we're not going to let them in here, but this is our space. And it's non-missionaries who say, well, we can accommodate them. So you've read the genre of literature, I'm sure, River on the River Kwai, and the Railway Man. Well, this is a counter story of missionaries who weren't so good when they were living under pressure. And the compromises, the ethical compromises. Here, Chengun Gilkey is one of the leaders of the camp, and he's trying to enforce this law against smuggling outside, and yet he himself is smuggling because he needs material to help some people. So how do you resolve a situation where two duties conflict? Remember Des Fort's saying, when two duties conflict, one ceases to be a duty. But which one? There's the rub. Yeah. Well, that was the kind of thing that Gilkey talks about in his book, Shantung Compound. The moral necessity of compromising one's moral convictions and maintaining your integrity. How do you do that? The moral necessity of compromising a moral conviction. Well, I tell that story because Siegfried Horn spent 6.5 years in a prisoner of war camp, no, in 6 different prisoner of war camps, shifted from place to place. And he knew what it was to try and reconcile conflicting moral demands, the uncomfortable necessity of doing that at times. So, there's a setup. Now for a potted biography of the ethical conundrums that this kind of pressure environment produces. How to maintain ethical integrity under pressure. In 1970, there was a chapel, lasted for 2 hours on the campus of Andrews University. Anybody there in 1970 heard this chapel? 3 men from the seminary or from the university participated. Charles Witcherby, Siegfried Horn, Richard Hammer. All 3 of them had been in prisoner of war camps. And they met this chapel morning, with Langdon Yelkin, who came up to campus, and a panel that lasted for 2 hours that day, with a discussion of the ethical implications and maybe how life in those camps had perhaps damaged them in some way in the long term. That's a question you may want to think about even this afternoon as we get towards the end. Because some of the things we're going to look at a little later in the program, and I may beg your pardon for going a little longer today, but the later part of the program will confront us with some very uncomfortable thoughts and reflections and decisions. In order to put those in a context, I'd like to just, first of all, give some background about Siegfried Horn himself. It will help us to understand some of the things that I will share with you from his diary later. So, a biography about Siegfried Horn. Born in 1908 to Clara Horn, his mother. His mother, 5 years before Siegfried was born, had become an Adventist, living in Germany, and soon after her baptism, she'd gone to Friedensau to study to be a Bible worker, come minister. Spent 3 years there and flourished as a new Adventist at Friedensau. On graduation, she was sent to Leipzig and there began to engage in selling books and in conducting Bible schools. And that's when she met, this is Clara before she was a Horn actually, what's her first name, I forget, her maiden name. But it was in that task in Leipzig in 1906-07 that she encounters the Horn family, has Bible studies, she baptizes the mother, Frau Horn, and then 6 months later, she marries Albert, the person that she's just baptized. That's the father of Siegfried. You get all that together, that little genealogy? So here's this happy family in Leipzig, and not long after Siegfried is born, 1908, his father becomes the test pilot when the aviation industry is in its infancy. And that's the plane he was flying. He was the first pilot to fly across Hanover, the city of Hanover, achieved history in that very frail plane. But it crashed in 1913, and Siegfried Horn's father perished in the crash. As a result of that, the family entered into some difficulty, and the years following were very taut financially. Clara pulled out of work for a while, but then when war broke out in 1914, and most of the German ministers were conscripted to serve in the military in First World War, Clara Horn was called back into ministry as a woman and asked to look after 10 churches in Leipzig. Men were very scarce. She worked under a retired pastor, so there was a pastoral team, but she did most of the work. And it was during this period that she didn't want to send young Siegfried to public school because he would have to go on Sabbath, and she was very strict about Sabbath and didn't want her children to go to school on Sabbath. So she worked on the local rabbi and got the rabbi to admit Siegfried into a yeshiva, a little Jewish school. So he spent his first 5 or 6 years in a Jewish school, learning Hebrew and enjoying that environment in Leipzig. Then they had to move and moved up to another town where he did have to go to public school. And his mother was insistent, you don't go to school on Sabbath. Several times she was fined by the police for not sending Siegfried to school on Sabbath. Sometimes they would come to the house and search for the children on Sabbath. And she had developed the art of hiding them in the attic or in some other place, or in a neighbour's place. Even as she still is a pastor of a church there in this new German city. For 2 weeks, she was placed in prison on behalf of her children because she refused to comply with the regulation to send children to school on Sabbath. Eventually, this devout, pious, quite strongly convicted German woman pastor was able to win reprieve from the Saxon government for children going to church on Sabbath. It was her faithfulness and her stubbornness that actually eventually persuaded the authorities to release that requirement for Sabbath keepers. Siegfried Horn grew up in that environment, and the Sabbath was especially close to his heart. It meant a great, as you can imagine, a great deal to him. At the age of 16, Horn went to Friedensau to study for the ministry. He was baptized at that age. He tells us later that he was baptized because you couldn't get into Friedensau any other way. That was a requirement. So he was baptized. And as he thought about it later, that's what all Adventists do when they're growing up, when they don't know anything else, they haven't been in any other faith tradition, so you get baptized. And he spent quite a few years there at Friedensau, became a college chauffeur for a while. Towards the end of his course, he ran into trouble with the church authorities, because they were insisting that he go colporteuring. And he was absolutely sure the Lord had not called him to colporteuring. That wasn't his calling. And that put him into some conflict. So he had to drop out for a while and then came back, was employed as the campus electrician and set up the electrical system, or the renewing of the electrical system. It was quite practical guy, actually. And resolved that, well, if I have to go colporteuring in order to get into the ministry here, I'll become a missionary. And I'll go out to the Dutch East Indies, because you don't have to go colporteuring there. So he took himself across to Stanborough Park and spent 6 months learning English and looking for a wife. Not very successful, because the first girl he proposed to said no. And then, once he'd had English under his belt, he needed Dutch. So he then went back to the Netherlands, spent 2 years there as a Bible worker and pastor, first 2 years of his ministry in the Netherlands, and looking for a spouse. Eventually he found someone who would say yes to him, one of the churches he was pastoring, and was delighted at that. And having settled that challenge, he took himself to the Dutch East Indies. His fiancée followed him 13 months later, and they were married in the Dutch East Indies in 1933. Jean Rothfuss was her name. And no family around, just other missionaries and other workers in what we now call Jakarta. I think Bratislava was the name earlier. That's what they looked like in 1934. Things were going along very well. He took a number of roles in his mission for several years in what we now call Indonesia. He was a youth director, he was president of a mission, one of the assistants in the union, sometimes wearing two hats because it was difficult to get people to go there, and he accepted 2 or 3 roles. These were the years when Nazi Germany was on the rise, and Hitler was moving into power. And in this Dutch-German home, there were considerable discussions about whether Hitler was a good guy or a bad guy. His wife, actually, the Dutch lady, was kind of persuaded that, well, maybe what Hitler is doing is good for people generally. He's getting us out through this terrible financial crisis. And Horn himself had lived through the collapse of the currency that followed between the two wars, and dealing with hyperinflation. He knew what hardship was in those years. His wife thought that the German Führer was not bad. Horn himself disagreed, so they had quite some problems with that. Until 1940, when Hitler invaded the Netherlands. And that persuaded his wife that this wasn't a good leader. But it created some dilemma for the family, because Jean is Dutch, Siegfried is German. He tried to take out a German passport, a Dutch passport, it hadn't arrived in time. And so here he is, a German national, suddenly an enemy of the Dutch. And so the first thing in 1940, after the invasion of the Netherlands, all the German nationals in what is now Indonesia are rounded up and imprisoned as enemy nationals. And this is Horn's first encounter with prison life. A little island off the coast of Jakarta, cramped conditions in a warehouse, terribly crowded, with very hostile Dutch military commanders who just loathed the Germans now for what the Germans were doing to their home country. So the hostility was really palpable. And Horn says in his biography that there were many instances of just outright raw hatred and hostility that he was witness to. After a little time in that first camp, he was moved across to another prison of war camp up in Sumatra, northern Sumatra, the steamy jungle, kind of camp cut out of the jungle, and there also very crowded conditions. And it was there that Horn found himself in even more trouble, because in the camp there were many Germans of many different kinds. There were the very pro-Hitler German prisoners, not so pro-German Hitlers, and the very anti-German, very anti-Hitler Germans. Did I get that right? Horn found himself in an argument in which he let it slip that he thought Hitler was a criminal. This was in a context where there had been some Jewish Germans who had been killed just 3 or 4 weeks before because the fascist Germans, the really radical Germans, had taken offense at them. And here Horn, who had made a determined stand, even in prison camp, not to break the Sabbath. So the other German prisoners began to think of him as a Jewish sympathizer. And when he let it slip that he thought Hitler was a criminal, he was warned the next day that a target had been placed on his back and that he needed to keep his tongue inside his head or his life would be finished. From there on, he had learned to keep his silence. His life he'd been warned about losing his life. He learned to survive through the First World War, through the currency crisis, and now in a prison of war camp, he was learning further survival skills. After his time in Sumatra, when the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor and the whole configuration of allies and axis shifted, suddenly Japanese were going to invade the Dutch East Indies, and the Dutch didn't know what to do with its German prisoners, so they shipped them off to India for the British to look after. So for the last part of his prisoner of war years, he spent in India at 3 different sites: Ramgarh, Dioli, and Dehradun. Right up there, those of you who've been in India know that it's just under in the foothills of the Himalayas. And there he spent the remainder of his years. Let me just pause to reflect on something that happened along the way. As he was being shipped out of Sumatra to India, they were being put on boats, and it so happened that there were 2 Siegfried Horns. And somehow the names got mixed up with the numbers. So the boat that he was meant to be on, he wasn't on. He went on the second ship. And the first ship was torpedoed en route somewhere up near Sri Lanka. And his wife, who's staying there in Jakarta, heard word that Siegfried Horn on the boat had lost his life because the ship had been torpedoed. So for most of the rest of the war, she lived as a widow. She thought she'd lost her husband. Only later was it discovered that the real Siegfried, her Siegfried Horn, hadn't been on that boat, but on the second boat, and he had made it to India. How do you repair a marriage 5 years, 6 years later after that kind of experience? His life in internment wasn't wasted. He was a diligent scholar. Jean had given to him in his second stage of imprisonment some books, about 70 books he'd been able to pass on to him. And so he'd made use of those. And he'd already had an interest, no training, but an interest in archaeology, and developed an interest in archaeology. Even he was there in prison war camp. He took time to translate the Old Testament into German, the whole thing, translate the New Testament by hand, written copies into German. He developed the 347 manuscript pages of the Ezra Nehemiah exilic period, the chronology problem of that. And you can see here quite a number of other manuscripts that he produced, handwritten manuscripts, during his time in prison and war camp. And he developed a regime of being able to teach others, other missionaries and other German nationals, Hebrew, Greek, and archaeology. He was a disciplined, as you can see from the way he writes his diary, with its careful, meticulous handwritten script, that he was a disciplined individual, and very bright and very curious. Reading his diary is just a marvel, learning about what he wanted to learn about. Not released until 1946. Does that ring a bell? It's a year after the war finished. And he's still in India, because they didn't know what to do with the German prisoners. Couldn't send them back to Germany. So it took some time to figure out what to do with Horn and a series of other missionaries there in that camp in Divinity. Eventually, with the help of a CA, I think an Anglo-Indian person by the name of C.A. Hart, working with the British authorities and the American embassy, they eventually were able to get Horn out of the prison with these several other prisons into America, not into Germany. And it was only then, even later, in March 1947, that he was able to be reunited with Jean. 7 years apart, 4 years where she was a widow. Well, from that point on, life moved quickly, a lot of time to make up. He hadn't got an accredited degree at Friedensau, it wasn't accredited at the period, so he quickly got an accredited degree from Wollwaller, then went to the seminary in Washington, took out a master's degree, and then took himself to the University of Chicago, where he took out a PhD in Egyptology, and developed a whole network of friends and colleagues and acquaintances. And it wasn't long. He was a fast learner. He was very intelligent and very committed and a diligent scholar. And very quickly he developed a church reputation, an admired reputation in the church, teaching in the seminary and writing materials for the church. He wrote almost 1,000 pages of the 7-volume Bible commentary. He was the author, many of them drawing from what he'd written in prison and war camp. So he made good use of those materials. The Bible dictionary that we all use, the Adventist Bible dictionary, he's the primary author of that. He really said to them at the beginning, I'm not going to participate in this unless you put my name on the cover. But they had some other authors and they didn't really like named volumes, so they insisted that it not be a named volume. But when he sent it to all his other archaeology and Old Testament colleagues beyond the church, they respected the volume. Conservative, but they respected its scholarship. He was the founder of the journal we know as Andrews University Seminary Studies. When the seminary moved from Washington, D.C. up to Berrien Springs, not long after that, it was Horn that established the first time that the church had a scholarly journal. And its first couple of issues, the General Conference people had to read the articles before it could go to press. That only lasted for 3 years. Eventually, they began to trust the scholars, and the scholars published the journal, as they've been doing ever since. So, Horn developed a reputation that was respected in the church. His book, you've probably all read, The Spade Confirms the Bible. Widely translated, very popular book. And one of his major contributions in that area was confirming the chronology of the Ezra period and also the date 457. He did a lot of work on demonstrating the validity of that date, not its prophetic meaning, but the validity of the historical date. So the church valued his services. He also developed an enormous international reputation. When you read his diaries, he meets Ernest Wright in this airport, and Albright in that airport, and Joyce Kenyon, Catherine Kenyon. Yes, a delightful description of Catherine Kenyon in her short skirt, and large size, and a cigarette. The one who did so much work on Jericho, that Catherine Kenyon. So he knew these people all around, was respected, published 800 different scholarly articles. So he was a prolific writer in the Bulletin of Archaeology, the New Eastern Archaeology, and other journals. Writing in, I take a little time on that, because I want you to understand something of Horn's public persona, his commitment to the church, his love, his deep, deep love for the church, and his solid conviction about the community and its Sabbath. He had this to say in 1974, the year after he became the dean of the seminary. He's in Frankfurt, not far from where he was baptized on this particular occasion. What I have and am, I owe to my church. And I'm grateful that my church has supported me and given me opportunities for growth and allowed me to pursue my various interests. His favourite text was that one from Romans 8:28, all things work together for good to them that love God. Committed to a sense of providence, looked at in the rearview mirror. Not easy to see going forward. And he wasn't the kind of person that had to explain every detail of providence, because he didn't believe in providence at that level, but he believed in the overall. God had been at work in his life, and he was grateful for it. And during that period of service, he grew. To live is to grow, and to grow is to change. And Siegfried Horn changed. Several sources of input to the change in his life and in his thinking. His mission experience, his cross-cultural experience that exposed him that things are not necessarily bad and good in cross-cultural settings, they're just different when you get to get accustomed to that. He learned from his war experience, keep his counsel, be careful of who you speak to, friend or enemy. His personal study, he was a devout scholar. His education at the University of Chicago and at the seminary. And at the seminary even, he had teachers who introduced him to some problems that there weren't any easy solutions for. His own research. His research took him to Shechem. Remember that, the whole story of the Shechem dig, where he was looking for a date to confirm this biblical reference, this very important biblical reference, and he spent season after season looking for the evidence for this, only to find the evidence wasn't there. And in fact, the evidence suggested something else. And he was willing to concede that to the church. That was a bit of a challenge. And his personal reflection, which he often engaged in through his diary. So, in this lengthy diary, we also encounter Siegfried Horn, the private persona. There's the public persona, and he took sermons all around and gave evangelistic meetings, talking about the dates and how archaeology confirms the Bible. He was committed to that. But yet he said in 1974, in recent years, my convictions have experienced quite a change and have become rather liberal in outlook. As occasional notes in the volumes of my diary penned during the last 30 years show. What kind of notes do we encounter in his diary? Here's an introduction to the interior, Siegfried Horn. So many unsolved problems is one of his themes. Right from his very beginning of work on the Bible commentary, 1953, 1954, they encountered the chronological difficulties. 6,000 years or not? And what kind of time frame were they going to use? They actually set up a committee in 1954 to resolve this, and the resolve from the committee was that the Usher chronology was inadequate, and they would not use it for the Bible commentary. That was the resolution of the committee in 1954. We Adventist historians have a hard job. Firstly, we have to harmonise history with the Bible, which is not always easy. Secondly, we have to harmonise both with Mrs. White's writings, which is even more difficult. And this has to be done in spite of our knowing that she has said that she is no authority on history. It is difficult to change, and we have to stick by our guns, not to cause explosions anywhere. Don't say anything, just keep it quiet. The men here, Nicol, Cottrell, and the others who are working on the commentary and in the General Conference, dare not release her statements that she did not want to be considered an authority on history, because they felt that if the church got exposed to that in too raw a way, it would be disturbing of the faith. One of his challenges was the conflicting data he was confronted with. He's here in the Middle East, travelling across the Sinai. We stopped at a well in Pul called Ain Musa. I'm not sure what happened. Not so sure what happened. He's been reading Exodus, and now he's thinking about the actuality of supposedly 2 million people crossing the desert with all their cattle. We drove for 200, so many unsolved problems, was his reflection. We drove for 250 kilometres through the desert. There is not a grass sprig anywhere, and saw only 1 or 2 people. One man asked me what the cattle of the Israelites had eaten. We had no answer, of course. Travelling through this area, we cannot understand everything of the Exodus story. One of the things that Horn was able to communicate in his Old Testament classes, those of you who have took his classes probably remember that he took time to explain how the 2 million may not actually be the 2 million, because we have a different term, and the term may mean clan, not thousand. I forget the Hebrew term, but the term could be mistranslated. So that was what he laboured in class to try and communicate. And when the evangelists came on campus and they heard the students explaining that, they went after the faculty for that. So he got a lot of criticism, even for that kind of approach to educating his students. Here he is in 1958 in Berrien Springs, and they're at a quadrennial Bible teachers meeting. Every 4 years, the Bible teachers from all over the colleges in North America would come together, and they would have a session together, professional development. And on this occasion, Dr. Yost, who's one of the professors at the seminary, discusses the historicity of Ellen White in a frank and masterly way, admitted mistakes in her books, and would not use them as historical source books. I believe in Sister White and believe her visions to be genuine, but do not grant that she stands on the level of Isaiah, Moses, or John the Baptist. I believe she wrote errors in history and theology, as there are errors in the Bible. This is 1958. Same year, same set of meetings. Next day. This morning, we had a discussion on Daniel 8:14 by Heppenstall, another respected authority in the church, in which much of our traditional position was talked away. Loseby said that there is not a text in the Bible supporting the investigative judgment. Who's Loseby? Roland Loseby, another professor at the seminary, who had spent a lifetime of service in India as a missionary. and was a very devout, committed Adventist. They concluded that it was all based on Ellen White. One can get really scared, he writes in his diary. It's a good thing I'm not a theologian, not a Bible teacher, or an evangelist pastor. Thank God. Horn, the private perspective. Here in 1961. 1961 is significant because by this time there were quite a number of Adventist scholars going to the SPL meetings that happen every year in November, sometimes in December in these early years. And in 1960, I think, they decided that the Adventist scholars that go to the SPL meetings would have their own Adventist scholarly meeting. Today they call that the Andrews Society? The Adventist Society of Religious Scholars, or Religious Studies, ASRS. So they have their own organisation now. And they meet every year, and it's quite a big event. Liv and I have the privilege of going to it on a regular basis. Well, this is their very first meeting, 1961. Yesterday, Sabbath, while at the St. Louis SPL meetings, we came together again from 9 in the morning till 12:30. The paper discussion was one read by Cottrell on prophetic interpretation. There followed a very heated discussion. It showed quite clearly that much of our prophetic interpretation is quite untenable, and in some cases not much different from that of the Qumran sectarians. Though I will not even breathe this statement for fear someone will hear it, for fear of the Jews. John 20. Ellen White's arbitrary statements have taken us on a marvellously confused way. Since she is considered inspired as every Bible writer, her statements on history and prophecy are taken as inerrant truths. That lies at the root of all our difficulties. 1961, first meeting of the Adventist Bible scholars together. And how did they handle that set of disagreements? Murdoch, William Murdoch, former president of Avondale, former president of Newbold, now the dean of the seminary here in not even the dean, he's Old Testament chair in 1961. He says, before they left that meeting, say little of the discussion and don't declare anyone a heretic. So they were prepared to acknowledge that there were problems. But let's not talk too widely about this, and let's not accuse each other of being a heretic as we explore these difficulties together. And then there was the science conflict, religion and science. 1964, the geoscience meeting that he attended were most interesting, he says. In the light of this indisputable evidence, he's talking about the radiometric dating, our scientists, with the exception of Frank Marsh, the biologist, who was very conservative, who believed in 6,004 years, maybe even October 6004. So Frank Marsh was the one who was really making it uncomfortable for others. Our scientists are searching for good answers acceptable to SPAs and cannot find them. Somehow and sometime we have to retreat from untenable positions, as the Catholics have been forced to do. 1964, confronted with information and data that just doesn't seem to fit with what we previously understood. There's another pattern that I discovered as I was reading through the diaries. There were those, that pattern that we've just talked about, that is the intellectual challenges, the data conflicts, and how he attempted to resolve them. There is this other fascinating pattern where, in response to those kinds of things, he reflects, I'm glad I don't have to teach that. Here's his comment on the intellectual conflict about science. There's the same meeting, 1964. The geoscience meetings were very most interesting. We just read that. Notice how he finishes his entry for that day. I'm glad I'm not a geologist. That was his refuge. I'm glad I don't have to teach this. I'm glad that professionally I don't have to wrestle with this. I'm an archaeologist. My data goes back to the time of Abraham. That's when my period of history begins. And I can be sure on those things. But don't talk to me about the stuff that Brian Timms has to wrestle with, or Howard Fisher. That's another set of problems. 1964. This is the interpretation of Daniel. We've read this one before, but notice how he finishes this. Problems everywhere. Oh, no, we haven't seen this one. During the meetings of the famous Daniel Committee, he's a member of that committee. The famous committee that Elder Figure set up to try and wrestle with the problems of exegesis of Daniel, where the exegesis that, if you engage in exegesis, you don't come out with the answers that Adventists want to come out with. And this committee was set up to try and resolve those. Desford used to speak about that committee quite often. During the meetings of the Daniel Committee on campus there in Cleveland, no, not Paris, but in Cleveland, we dealt with many perplexing problems. I pointed out that our interpretation of Daniel 8, which is counter to all logical principles of exegesis, Ray Cottrell voiced similar views. The others want to stick to absurd views, believing they can be proved from the Bible only. This is to his diary, remember. He's confiding this quietly to his diary. Problems everywhere. I'm glad that I'm not teaching exegesis. 1966, here he is at Avondale, teaching summer school. Came out in December, taught right through the summer until maybe early February. And in the afternoon of January 29, they had the fourth meeting and taught by Eric Magnuson. And Siegfried Horn heard Eric speak, a young science teacher of the college, who has 2 PhDs. He presented the ages of the rocks determined by their radioactivity. Some rocks which showed me thousands of millions of years old. We have held to the 6,000 years age of the Earth so long and are now confronted with facts for which we have no answers and which our men are not prepared to face. I'm glad to work in the relatively safe area of history. And that's how he got around the problem in his classes or in discussions. He avoided talking about things that he didn't feel he was an authority on. An authority in archaeology, indeed. But if you want to survive and still be an archaeologist that can contribute to the church, you don't expose yourself to those other problems. In '66, there were several curriculum changes. They were changing to a BD degree and requiring the students to stay on campus for an extra year. And the students didn't like that. They wanted to get out of ministry. And students coming from South America and maybe even from Australia who had studied the life and teachings of Jesus from Desire of Ages and nothing else. Any students here who studied life and teachings with Desire of Ages as the textbook? Well, at the seminary from 1966 on, they encountered a new course called Introduction to the New Testament, taught by Harold Weiss, Earl Hilgert, and the Japanese teacher, Sakai Hura, thank you, senior man. And there was a lot of criticism of being exposed to the synoptic problem, the fact that John might be different to the 3 others. And this was new territory to these students who came. They might have learned a little bit about synoptic, but their study of the Gospels and the life of Jesus had been purely on a harmony basis. And here now they were encountering synoptic problems for the first time. And they complained bitterly. And a union president came onto campus from the Pacific Union and heard all these complaints and confronted the faculty with them. And suddenly Horn and his colleagues, 1966, are aware that they may be entering another period of witch hunting. Terrible period of the seminary, 66, 7, 8, 9, until 70, maybe even afterwards. And he's aware who will be the scapegoat this time. He's aware that it might cost some scalps. Here he is in 1968. This is an interesting one to Australians, particularly to those who were here at Avondale as students in 1968. Some of you may have sat in a class with Lennon Moulds. I got a letter, he's in Heshbon at this time. Got a letter from Elder Johns, another teacher at the seminary. Elder's letter contains the news that Little Knowles was dismissed from work in Australia. It's too bad he could not keep his mouth shut, but had to speak his liberal mind even when his opinion was not asked. The seminary will not grow in the esteem of the Australian brethren who think that they represent the last bastion of orthodoxy in the Adventist movement. It's good that my visit lies behind me, because if they really knew what I thought, they wouldn't invite me again. You'll have to read that story in Ostriches and Canaries. I have half a chapter devoted to the background story. Those of you who were here remember those events. It was my last year at Avondale when Little Knowles was walking across the campus here. I didn't get to take a class from him. But the issues that he faced with then, we thought were horrific. Now, not so bad. 1968, Horn is aware of a looming crisis. We had this week 6 faculty meetings. Some of these grew out of the troubles in Australia. Because when then Chucky Moles was confronted with the dilemma, he said, well, this is what I learned at the seminary. Seminary folks said, no. He was like that before he came. And there may be some evidence to that, because down in Washington, when he was there, when the seminary moved up, the president of the Washington Missionary College knew him and said, yeah, he's like that, but that's not a major problem. So the Washington Missionary College president didn't have difficulty. And he was teaching for them as an adjunct lecturer. But here at the seminary, they have 6 faculty meetings, 3 of them to discuss the seminary brand of heresies, 2 to accept the assignment of publishing a book on the sanctuary. No one wanted to do it because they knew of the problems involved and how to do it in a way that was true to the text and yet true to Adventist convictions. That was the problem that they were wrestling with. And Horn, at this time, is sympathetic to Richard Hamill, the president of the university. I see heads rolling in the future. Hamill has not an enviable task. Coping with the pressure from the field, from the pressure from administration. By now, Pearson is the president, and Pearson's pressure is we don't want any more liberalism. This creeping liberalism is destroying the church. So Hamill had that pressure on him, and here he was struggling to deal with teachers. April 69. A dramatic change has taken place in the setup of the Biblical Research Committee. One of Pearson's strategies to try and control the creeping liberalism was to restructure the BRI and have only administrators on it. And the Bible scholars would be just consultants. And it was the administrators who would make decisions for the church on theology. When that plan was rolled out to the faculty, there was a riot, so to speak, and a huge pushback. And so Pearson had to take that back and say, well, let's have at least a few scholars on it together with the administrators, but the administrators still outnumbered the scholars. I'm glad to be an archaeologist and historian, and not a theologian or an exegete. Here's this recurring pattern, now in 1969. 1969, the seminary lost a teacher, Ted Vick. Anybody do classes with Ted Vick? A British teacher who taught at Canada and then come down to the seminary. And Horn had been one of those who advised Hamill to take Ted Vick on as a teacher. And now it's just not possible to retain Ted Vick as a teacher. And he has to be let go. He goes back to England. And Horn's reflection on this, it's sad that a brilliant mind cannot find a place in our system, and that so many of the young teachers at the seminary who see this happening feel so threatened. The future will pose a real problem in this respect. I'm so glad that I can watch it from the bleachers and am not involved in decision making. 1969, he visits with a German friend. He helps to conduct the evangelistic meetings that his German friend in New York is conducting. He talks about archaeology, confirming the Bible. 457 is a valid date. But then at the end of that weekend, he says, I'm glad that my good luck has taken me to a type of work so different from his. It's marvellous that I can spend practically all my time on my hobbies and even get paid for it. 1977, he's retired, just finished 3 years, climax of his career, as Dean of the Seminary. And he's retired in Pleasant Hill in the suburb of San Francisco. And the latest spectrum has come to his house, which discusses the GC's attempts to create an Adventist creed, which among other points wants to nail down the age of the earth for which there is no biblical basis. You remember that episode, 1976-77, where the GC was trying to impose a creed on the Bible teachers that insisted that a literal creation story of 6 literal days and 6,000 years. They wanted to embed that in this creedal statement. And they took that statement around. Jeff was just telling me that they even brought it here to Avondale. And they had big discussions in 76 or 77 about those statements. There was huge pushback on that attempt from the scholars, and it was eventually abandoned, although they did publish it in the Review and Herald. But again, we have this I am glad kind of approach from Siegfried Horn. I'll be glad, for I would fight vehemently against the adoption of such a creed. I would have failed in both respects and would have become a heretic and an outcast. I'm not very happy to see the way the church is going. It certainly antagonizes all the intellectuals. I'm coming to an end, folks, so we've got time for some questions. 1978, Pine Springs, which is the ranch just up the hill from Loma Linda. He's there at a series of meetings, and they're having a full-on discussion about the nature of Christ. This is right in the peak of the righteousness by faith debates, remember? Where the nature of Christ is so critical to which side you take in the righteousness by faith. The Herb Douglas camp and the Desmond camp. And Horn just found that, couldn't understand it. Why waste time on discussions like that about the nature of Christ? I'm glad I'm not involved in those kind of controversies. He was on his way for the opening of the Horn Library on the campus, the Horn Archaeology Museum, just established. And he was heading up from Pleasant Hill in San Francisco, driving across the country to participate in the opening weekend for that. He has a heart attack on the way. So he's in hospital in Iowa. And it's while he's in hospital that someone brings to him the news that Elder Pearson has just resigned because of ill health. Elder Pearson, who was elected in 1966, kept going through till the end of 1978, had stroke troubles, or at least premonitions of stroke, and doctors said to him, you've got to escape from this, you can't keep going. It was the stress and the pressure of those attempts to impose a creed that had caused so much stress on Elder Pearson. And his health gave way. And when Horn hears that, many people may be saved into the kingdom by him no longer being stumbling to their Christian experience. I'm glad that Wilson got this job, though I'm surprised that they gave it to him, since he's taken as being somewhat of a liberal. Categories, never helpful, are they? Never very helpful. Thinking of Donald Wilson as a liberal. Here's someone we know, 1980. Horn didn't get to go to the Sanctuary Review Committee at Glacier View, but he was there for the scholars meeting afterwards. And it's there that he learns that Jim Cox has been appointed the president of Avondale. And he notes in his diary that night, I've learned that Jim Cox has been asked to become the president. I'm very glad, here's one of these glad statements. I'm very glad for this rehabilitation. He deserves it after what he went through 4 years ago. He's referring to when Jim Cox had to go through an inquisition from Elder Pearson and Elder Hackett because he believed certain things about the Synoptic Gospels. But eventually he held his ground and became the chair of the New Testament department. And I'm equally happy that Sakai Kubo has become president of New Bold College. These men were maligned and persecuted without cause under the previous administration, and certainly didn't deserve a break. Here's the issue that confronts us, and confronts any administrator who's been responsible for the lives and the careers of others. Jeff will know, when you're in an administrative position and you're just not making decisions for yourself, but there are others whose lives depend on the decisions you make. Here's Elder Wilson speaking to the GC staff the morning after he's interviewed Des Ford. And he's told Elder Ford, Dr. Ford, about the decision that's going to be made down in Washington, down in Moronga, that they can't continue him in service. And that not that his credentials will be removed, but that he cannot continue his career of teaching for the church. And Elder Wilson is aware that some people may think that he's being hypocritical, because Elder Wilson knows the problems. Elder Wilson is familiar with Ray Cottrell, who's talked through some of the problems with him. So this is his explanation to the GC staff on the morning at a huge staff worship. If my conscience will not let me accept these things, these church beliefs, then I remove myself from the arena of conflict. To me, there's no big problem with that. If you're going to be claimed to teach for the church, there are certain minimal conditions that you will have to meet. If you don't feel comfortable with that, the Lord has something else for you to do. Now, the way Elder Parmenter would have put that question, which he did to Des, was if in conscience you cannot accept these things that the church believes, you remove yourself from the community and you hand in your credentials. That was Elder Parmenter's challenge to Des. Notice Elder Wilson's very carefully nuanced response as he explains it to people that he knows in the audience, in his GC staff worship, and there are some who understand this and may agree with him. So he says, I remove myself from the arena of conflict. He's very nuanced in his explanation. Notice the date of that, September 5, that entry in his diary. Just after Elder Wilson has given his explanation of why they're going to have to let Des go. And he knows that it's a very sensitive issue to many in the GC staff worship. Several months before that, Elder Wilson was attending a BRI meeting at Lone Linda. Siegfried Horn was there for the same BRI meetings. And after the meetings, Horn encounters Wilson and they have a chat. And Elder Wilson explains to Horn what's happening with Des. Notice the date, January 20. Des has been in Washington and he's working on his manuscript. He's been there for about a month now. And they're not comfortable with the progress or with the attitude that Dr. Ford is showing. Neil Wilson, who said that he wished Des Ford had followed my example and kept quiet, as I had done with regard to the problems of chronology and Old Testament history, which I had faced. That was from the conversation of Wilson with Horn. Horn reflects on that. This remark, he says to himself, showed me clearly that the Washington hierarchy must have talked about me and may have worried that I would cause them trouble. They're probably happy that I'm shunted aside before I could do any harm. This is 1980, and he's already been out of the deanship for 3 years. He retired from the deanship in 1976. So here we are concluding now. Dr. Horn regarded himself as a self-aware liberal. Terms are not very clear. A liberal Adventist is conservative when you are looking at the wider sphere of Christian life. So these terms are relative. And he's using the term in this relative way because he is a a committed Adventist, solidly Adventist. 1970, today I learned we go through a crisis. I'm too old to fight for liberalisation of Adventist doctrines. But the process will go on. It cannot be stopped. Because information keeps appearing, data keeps surfacing. Here he is in 1973. He's writing this in his diary late at night after he's had quite a shock to his system that particular day. Murdoch, William Murdoch, former President of Governor, Dean of the Assembly, is just retiring. And they can't find someone to replace him who's acceptable to the many different factions in the church. The Douglas faction and the Kenwood faction. You know, it's difficult to find someone acceptable. So Elder Wilson settles on the name with his colleagues of Siegfried Horn. It's the first day of the annual board meeting, 78 January. I cannot see what they see in me. I'm not a great speaker, I'm not very pious, rather liberal Bible standards, I'm vegetarian. Well, he was vegetarian, but not when he was out on the street and other things. I do not have the charisma of Murdoch, and do not like administrative duties. Well, perhaps I should help them out, although I think they make a mistake to choose me. I cannot think of anyone more unfit for the job than I am. And the choice of these men shows clearly how fallible they can be. He disagreed vehemently with the brethren when they shifted it from Washington to Berrien Springs. Who would take a seminary out into the boondocks? You know, where are the libraries around Berrien Springs that you've got here in Washington? So he never came to terms with that. Always disagreed with that, even later. But he went along with it. Here's the next day, after he's been approached the night before. 5:30 I got up, after less than 5 hours sleep. 6:50 I called Hamill and told him once more that by appointing this thing, they made a mistake, as they made in 1958 when they decided to move the seminary from Washington to Berrien Springs. But that just as then, I would be loyal, though not believing. He was grateful to be an Adventist, deeply grateful. 1974, the year after he became the dean, he's back in Germany in August, his summer holidays, visiting his mother, who's very aged now, she's nearing almost to her 90s, and her name is still in the yearbook. He took great pride in the fact that his mother, who began work as a minister back in 1940, still has her name in the yearbook as a committed, devout, pious believer in Adventism, all the way through to the day she died, 1979. So he's there visiting his home. And it's the 50th anniversary of his baptism. He's very careful about dates. Baptized in Chemnitz, 9th of August, 24. I was 16 at the time, and would probably have waited longer to take this step if it had not been for the fact that I needed to be a member of the Adventist Church in order to be admitted to the mission seminary at Friedensau, where I began my training a few months later. So he spent time at Friedensau, and then at Stanborough Park. And it was at Stanborough Park that he became committed to the church. Not at Friedensau, after all those years at Friedensau, but something happened, some experience, that led to this wholesale commitment of life and thought to the church in 1930. The baptism was not a result of conversion, he says, of that pre-Friedensau. I simply conformed with customs. I've been raised in Adventism, seemed to be the natural thing to belong to the church with my parents and grandparents. However, I experienced a kind of conversion 5 years later in England, and then became an Adventist who was fully convinced that salvation was possible only if I remained a faithful member of this church, fully believing each of its doctrines and carrying out all its policies and regulations, regardless of whether they're based on the Bible or not. His church meant a great deal to him. He belonged to his church. He believed with his church as far as he could. He behaved with the church as far as he could. You know Rick Rice's book, believing, behaving, belonging. Which comes first? Belonging, believing, behaving, or the other way around? Illustrated in the life of Siegfried Horn here. My church, I want to support it as best I can and stay with it. In recent years, my convictions, same entry of the diary, 1974. In recent years, my convictions have experienced quite a change and become rather liberal in outlook. We've read that statement earlier in the talk today. Yet I have neither the desire nor the intention to change my church affiliation or to leave my church. What I have and am, I owe to my church. And I'm grateful that my church has supported me and given me opportunities for growth and allowed me to pursue my various interests. And since my church is tolerant enough to allow me as a liberal Adventist to work within this church organisation, I want to support it as best I can and stay with it. This half century has passed quickly, and I wonder how many more anniversaries I will celebrate. My mother recently celebrated her 70th anniversary of baptism, and I hope I can follow in her footsteps. He had to adjust along the way in his thinking about the age of life on earth, the interpretation of the Exodus story, the interpretation of Daniel and Titus. He thought he would go further than his thought on how to understand Antiochus. The investigative judgment, he followed heaven's call on that. The idea that a sacrifice transfers sin. Desolator of the sanctuary, being the saints, no, a little horn. He adjusted to those things. The imminence of the Advent, the rigidity of dietary structure, the authority of our mind. So, in conclusion today, I've said that about 3 times, sorry. When does being quiet compromise integrity? When does keeping silent lead you to become a collaborator? He knew what that meant from prison war camps. How to be a change agent who survives. How to create a church that can cope with change more easily. And how to be patient as a church. And with the church as we change and grow together. Hopefully, reflecting on the life of Siegfried Horn will help us as we think through those issues. Thank you for being so patient with such a long-winded speaker.
It wouldn't be an Adventist gathering without an offering, would it? You're probably aware that there are costs involved to running the Sydney Adventist Forum, and we hope that you feel able to contribute this afternoon. The people who are sitting on this right-hand side of the chapel, you'll find on the floor at the right-hand end an offering bag. We ask if those people who are sitting on the right-hand end of the row would pick up the offering bag and pass it to their left. And the people who are sitting on this end, if you leave the offering bag on the floor, we shall arrange for them to be picked up. I think that's fairly straightforward. If they're all progressing, I can't see if they've all been picked up or not, but it doesn't matter all that much. Okay. I'm just wondering, we're proposing to have a bit of time for questions. If it would be better if we move this slightly aside. What do you think, Lachlan? And we can move the stools forward a little bit too. I think, Brenton, you're going to take one microphone. We'll share one. I think you'll have most of them.
I'd like to hear responses from the audience as well.
Yes.
This is a discussion.
Brenton will pass the microphone. We'll ask you to raise your hand. I'll try to sort of point to people in approximately the order in which their hands are raised. And you're probably aware that this program is being live streamed. So for purposes of that program, if you wish to identify yourself, please give your name before you ask a question of Gil. If you don't want to be identified, well, don't do that. Okay, I'll give my microphone to Brenton. Thanks, Brenton.
And we are taking questions from live stream too, Howard, so I might break in with one if we get one.
There's a hand right at the back.
Lyle's always kind to these questions.
Gil, thanks so much for your presentation. I loved it and had many happy memories of Andrews as you were going through that. Here we are though, probably 40 or 50 years since those days, and the Adventist experience now is a massively multicultural experience. And I'm just intrigued as to whether you in your travels have found any region of Adventism more able to cope with ambiguity than any other region. Let me just give you one example of something that has utterly amazed me, and that is the experience of reading Africans in Spectrum magazine, who seem to me to be stunningly over a lot of these issues, and previously I wouldn't have thought that were possible. What do you see happening around the world in Adventism in relation to how people are coping with change?
Good question, Lyle. And I don't travel really that far around, but I am able to keep in touch with folk that come and go through Loma Linda. And of course I read like you do. But I think education is a very powerful force. It's a slow moving force, but it is a very powerful force. And in areas in Africa, there are strong universities that were planted decades ago that are now beginning to flourish. And as people in those institutions become aware, they also are learning to cope with new data and with the tensions that arise. That's happening in some places in Asia, not quite so extensively, but certainly in parts of Africa, and of course it's happening in America and in Europe and here in Australia or New Zealand. And I think that the sense of ambiguity is widely being shared where the sense of belonging to the church is becoming a kind of, that's the tie. It's my church, and I can, I can cope with its odd bits and pieces, but it's a beautiful community, it's a powerful community, there's something to share with the world. You get that sense strongly at Loma Linda. Even, the ambiguity, in fact, you see in Loma Linda itself, it demonstrated. You've got a range of congregations there that are really quite surprising. Very rigidly conservative, very way out, modern and contemporary. Churches that are really focused on belonging and professors, retired professors who have their sense of identity. And you have people that are exposed to that variety of Adventism, that big tent Adventism, going back to their locations. Let me give you an illustration. When I was in Thailand, we were looking for a teacher of biology. And would you believe we got an application from a biology teacher from Babcock. And his field, we wanted him to teach just first, second, third year biology courses, but his field was evolutionary biology. And he sent in his CV and we interviewed him. He came and taught for us for a year or two, then went back. And the issue of what he'd specialised in wasn't an issue because he was teaching specifically, a fairly narrow curriculum in biology. But I think there are folk like that in many of those institutions who are aware of the issues. And you see them writing, like you say, in Spectrum, on the website. And I think as they develop journals of their own, you will find broader discussion. So it is a slow process, but I'm confident and hopeful because education is a powerful force. And it teaches us to think for ourselves. If it's education, the kind of education that our right encourages us to follow. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm hopeful.
Hello, Gil. It's Gwen Wilkinson. Excuse me for not standing. I'll finish the question before I get up. You said that this journey of investigating Siegfried Horn started because you'd asked Lawrence Geraghty if there was anything in the diaries about Glacier View. In your talk, very little mention was made of Glacier View that I picked up. Is there more you could comment on about that, or do we need to wait for your article?
Well, actually, there's not a lot in the diary on Glacier View. The key thing that for me, that really kind of blew me away when Larry first showed it to me, and he culled out the extract, was that conversation with Wilson at Loma Linda, where he said, if only you'd kept your mouth shut. No, if only Des had kept his mouth shut. I was working on a couple of articles for Spectrum. I'd already completed the article for the encyclopedia, and that stimulated a whole other set of questions about the role of Elder Wilson in this. And because as I was reading the correspondence for the encyclopedia articles, I became aware that Elder Wilson knew of the problems, because I had read where Elder Cottrell had spent a whole evening with him, talking with him through the problems. And it seemed to me that Elder Wilson's real problem with the issue that grew out of 1979 and the talk at PUC was the fact that Des had gone public and created a huge ecclesiological problem. And that then he said in that conversation with Horn, the problem was that he just didn't keep quiet. The only other information from the diary about the period was when Des was having difficulty getting his commentary on Daniel through Southern Publishing, and it had been held up. It had been approved by the committees, and yet some said, no, we've got to be careful here, and Des had tweaked it again and rewritten it. And in order to finally get it through, Richard Coffin, sent the manuscript to Siegfried Horn and said, can you read the manuscript for us? And we'll give you $100 to read it through and tell us whether we should publish this commentary on Daniel. And Horn's comments in the diary are, I see no problem with it. It's safe, it's in line with what you can find in the Bible commentary and elsewhere. In fact, I myself probably would go further in the area of Antiochus Epiphanes than Des is prepared to go. But it was because Horn had signed off on it that they published it through Southern Publishing. And of course, after the Glacier View issue, they withdrew it. So the sensitivities and how to manage the church and keep it together, the administrative problem was a real challenge. Yeah. I don't know if that helps, but
Thank you.
Yeah, Paul Rankin, I'm very glad I'm not a theologian or an exegete. But I am curious about Horn's personal life. Did the marriage work out? Did he have kids or anything?
no children. Well, they did have a child in the Indonesian days, but died shortly afterwards, and no further children. So it was he loved Jean dearly, but it was a strained relationship. And they enjoyed doing things together. And he was committed to her, but he was an intensely curious individual. I mean, let me not put that as a but, as a contrast. That suggests the wrong thing. He eventually married 3 times. She died when they were on a tour to the Middle East, and she's buried on the side of Mount Carmel in a cemetery there. Larry was there and helped to arrange the funeral. There was a Dutch lady living with them in the house. That was a friend of Jean, his first wife, and he eventually married her in his second marriage. She had to move out of the house when he went back to Washington, D.C. President of the university said, "No, you can't stay living in that relationship. She should move out." So after a few years, when he retired, in fact, he married her. And then when she died, he married the third time for the last couple of years of his life. He was a very colourful individual in that he wanted to learn about life, very curious, and she was too. And they had she was a nurse, and they had a great deal of interest. She got upset that he travelled so often, but they had not a warm, vibrant relationship, but a committed, loving relationship. Yeah. I don't know if that helps, but
Thank you.
yeah.
I have a question, Gil, and normally I wouldn't do that, but I'm looking for others, so I'll have one while somebody else is thinking of one. Noticed a lot of sitting on the sidelines. I kept my head down, I kept quiet. I'm looking for a leader with a little bit more guts. How did you feel when he survived and made a contribution? But how did you feel as he continued to sort of lie low?
There is a sense coming through the Glacier View experience myself. There is a sense of disappointment that he didn't find opportunities to be more outspoken. So I must confess that I was disappointed. And yet on later reflection and a more mature reflection, and when I went back and read some of the earlier diaries and realized just his growing up years, his close link with the church, his honouring of his mother, what she meant to him about the Sabbath, and his own commitment to the Sabbath, that he felt he needed to come to terms with the relationships himself. And he wanted to be able, and this is a delicate balance, and there's no easy answer. He wanted to preserve his ability to be of service to the church, to be a change agent in the church, even if the change would take a long time. He knew that if he was too outspoken, that would limit his influence, and he didn't want to split the church. I was disappointed, but man, I can understand the ethical dilemma that he wrestled with. Yeah. Good question. Thank you.
Lachlan Rogers. My question, I think, follows on from that. I was struck by the fact that some of the issues you alluded to, and you had quotes from him on, were being written an entire lifetime before I was born, my lifetime before I was born, and yet are the same issues, many of them, that are still the issues that seem to be difficult, sensitive, a bit taboo. And I wondered to myself, there are certainly, you've emphasized his commitment to the church. I suspect that generational change means that there are plenty of people that don't feel today the same fundamental sense of commitment to the church as an organization. And look at some of these issues and ponder, it's been quite a long time. Maybe there's another place where I should be. So I guess it's not really a question, it's an observation. It's a question about the pace of change, and I guess almost the perceived lack of it. And I suppose the legacy of survival, but if anything, at what cost?
Good question, and a difficult one, because it impacts life and people that fall by the wayside, and people that are injured or damaged in the process, even at Andrews. You know, the people that their careers were terminated, and as Horn laments, you know, if only they could have, the church could have found a way to have embraced them and continued. It is a slow process. And the issues that we grappled then before you were, some of them in my lifetime, are still very much present in. And there are many who feel that we were unable to resolve them, and so they don't see the church as having relevance. There's a series recently that the Sligo Church Sabbath School, Faith and Reason, have been conducting. Why I am still an Adventist. And they've had a variety of people come and speak on that question. Why I am still an Adventist, when there's so many cognitive things that are difficult to hold together. There's a term for that, cognitive disjunction or something like that. Dissonance, cognitive dissonance, yeah. And it's interesting to hear the reflections of mature people like a Larry Garrity, like a Bill Johnson, you know, who's very much aware, and now who participates in a very contemporary church with music that he can't stand, but that he goes there every Sabbath because he sees, in fact, that that's the future of the church, and he's committed to it, even though he has to wear earmuffs. And the answers were somewhat encouraging. Kendra's going to give her contribution to that Sabbath School series in several weeks' time. But I gave a talk to that church, and for me, in a sense, Siegfried Horn's story was really an answer to that question, why I am still an Adventist, even though some of the data, you know, my community hasn't yet accepted, and when will they accept it? And if truth be truth, and that's the one thing that draws Adventists on, is it's a commitment to truth. However long the journey, we are committed to truth. And so in that sense, I'm hopeful. And our gifted pioneer, with all her flaws and failings, committed us to education. And education will do its work. So learning to be patient, I guess, is the challenge, and encouraging our young people to be patient and to find in the community meaning and faith and hope, you know, that it does give us meaning and look forward positively to the kingdom of God that will come. And, you know, all of those things together, I guess, are what for me work to help me stay committed as an Adventist. But I can identify with the challenges that other people experience. And I wish the process were more rapid along the way. When I finished my book, Ostriches and Canaries, I sent it to an Adventist publisher. And the publisher read it and said, man, our people need to hear this and they need to read it. Chair of the publishing house. And then he said, but there haven't been enough funerals yet. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? But the clock keeps ticking. So, yeah, and that's an existential problem for Adventists. We are still here, and we had this imminent hope, and we hold on to it. But we've got to adjust, because the clock does keep ticking, and we are here to learn and to grow, and to live is to grow, and to grow is to change. And the church at the moment is as Lyle was saying, is very multi-diverse. It's a multi-hued big tent, and that's an encouragement. We need administrators who can shepherd the whole. One of the problems is that I guess administration at the moment wouldn't be welcome in some of those churches around Loma, or wouldn't feel comfortable. We need an administration that can pastor the whole of the church. And maybe Lord give us such administrators.
I'm very glad I'm not a theologian.
Bless you.
And do you mind if I don't stand up? And I'm coming from, I'm not a brilliant, like most people here, but I noticed that those points that have been of issue are not really relevant to our salvation. That we, as long as we focus on Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, the truth, we can live together in harmony, even when we disagree. And I think that what Lyle said makes a lot of sense, is that, you know, Jesus didn't run ahead. He didn't change much while he was on earth. He spoke when he needed to, but he also kept quiet when he needed to. So to keep us together, sometimes we do have to hold back and be thoughtful of those who are way behind and just keep the thing together. What concerned me most was where he said that he felt that by being faithful to the church, he would be saved. He got his salvation by being faithful to the church. Now, I could not agree with him there, but I do believe that our church does have a part to play. And that if we all live together and accept that people have different ideas and that there is growth in certain areas, which many of those who are coming along find that they are scared of them. They're scared of the change that will maybe turn the church upside down. And so those at the head have got to kind of keep that balance. And it's hard, you know, because it's so much easier to be somebody who stands up and says, speaks out and looks like the hero. But actually, in the long run, that quietness was great wisdom, because we've learned a lot by all this discussion, which is ongoing.
Thank you for the comment, beautiful comment, that learning to focus on those central things that Jesus said to us, to his disciples, didn't he? There is much that I would like to share with you, but you cannot bear it now. And that's what a pastor has to learn and appreciate in that congregation that they nurture, and that's what an administrator needs to appreciate deeply. The challenge is when there are those who think that those who don't agree with you are not really Adventists. And that pressure usually comes from a conservative or maybe a more fundamentalist perspective that want to purify the church and keep it pure and simple. That's where the challenge, and that's the challenge for a pastor. And I guess what I rejoice at, in a sense, is that we have made progress. There was a time when what we taught in some of our core doctrines actually made life miserable for Adventists, because they thought they weren't forgiven or could never be good enough to stand in the last days without a mediator. You know, when they thought they had to be perfect, and that, you know, the whole idea of the record of sin on the sanctuary, the sacrifice transferred your sin, and it wasn't really forgiven until the very end. It took a heaven storm to help us work through that and say, well, that's not really the way we understand Scripture. That's the next biography. I'm up to the time when he's just about to retire. So you'll enjoy the biography of Heavenstorm, who helps us to understand that process. Even Heavenstorm got into trouble for helping us through that journey. But he survived, and we've been blessed by it. Yeah, good comment. Thank you so much. Yeah.
You got to make this the last question, Gil. One of your early slides caused me some surprise, and that was that Siegfried Horn wrote his diaries in English. And I wondered why that might have been. And Gil, do you think that he did that because he hoped somebody like you would find him.
Truth be told, he wrote in German and then shifted to English. So his early volumes, until the time he got to, I think, America, up until about 1950-51, well, maybe not that many, maybe until he got to India, so that part of his experience, that they are in German and they've been translated. And the latter ones, in English, we hope that over time they can be available to scholars beyond myself to read and to learn from. So that's a project that's going. But I think there is something about his background in Germany, in a tiny little Adventist sect, in a giant state that was hostile to religion and certainly hostile to a little sect like Adventist, shaped him and shaped his values and his loyalties, and that even though he couldn't agree intellectually with what his president was doing, he would, and some feel that kind of approach is actually a result of damage from the war experience, or even damage from his early growing up years. And that may be, but I guess we all have to learn to live with even the damage that we carry in our personas. We're all frail human beings, doing the best we can. And he was grateful, ever grateful for his church and wanted to help it. So, good question, thank you. Thank you so much this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, Gil, for sharing part of your time and your visit with us. We have really enjoyed this presentation. I would think that there are many more questions that are still fermenting in people's minds as a result. We trust that the rest of your time here in Australia will be valuable to you, and enjoyable. I understand you're visiting family, so God bless you in your travels, and safe travelling, and more power to your pen. Let's just close in prayer. Remember to use this. Father, we thank you for this reflection this afternoon. It shows us that we need to be able to tolerate perhaps diversity in our church more than has been sometimes, and that diversity is not a weakness but a strength. And I hope that you will continue to bless our church, and that the variety of thoughts and opinions still may come together and bring glory to your name and advance your kingdom, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.